Hi, everyone. I hope you're all doing well, and thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Malaika Magadza. I am a researcher focusing on irregular warfare and anti-colonial resistance in Southern Africa, a longtime friend of McCann, and I will be facilitating today's talk. Today, we are very excited to be joined by Brian Raftopoulos and Mandisi Majavu. Professor Brian Raftopoulos is a Zimbabwean scholar and activist. Formerly Associate Professor of Development Studies at the University of Zimbabwe, he is currently the Director of Research and Advocacy at the Okuthula Trust. He has published widely on Zimbabwean history, labor history, historiography, politics, and economic issues. He has been a civic activist in Zimbabwe since the 1990s, was a member of the founding task force of the National Constitutional Assembly from 1998 to 2000, as well as the first chair of the Crisis in Zimbabwe Coalition from 2001 to 2003. Dr. Mandisi Majavu is a senior lecturer in the Department of Political and International Studies at Rhodes University. His research investigates the political history of racial formation in South Africa. Dr. Majavu's scholarship investigates the intricacies of racial formation across space and time, ranging from white racism and racial formation in South Africa to anti-Black racism in Australia and New Zealand, from white missionaries and Christianity in the 19th century South Africa to race and liberalism. Dr. Majavu is also author of the book Uncommodified Blackness. Just a note as well, the speakers and myself today are speaking in our own personal capacities. We're not representing any organizations. Before we start the conversation with the speakers, I'll give a very brief background about today's topic. So, to begin, over the past few weeks, we've seen once again the full force and breadth of Israel's colonial violence with yet another round of bombings on the Gaza Strip, widespread arrests and colonial raids into West Bank refugee camps, Palestinians shot and killed, and physical assault on Palestinian worshippers in Jerusalem. In recent years, there has been a shift among international activists who are increasingly using the term apartheid to describe how Palestinians are being oppressed. Moving beyond just talking about occupation and occupied territories, advocates for Palestinian rights have found in the apartheid paradigm a more comprehensive way of understanding the reality facing Palestinians both inside and outside of historic Palestine. That is, an institutionalized system of racial domination designed to enhance Israel's colonial project and to maintain Jewish supremacy. Following the work of Palestinian groups over many years, mainstream international human rights organizations such as Amnesty and Human Rights Watch are now also reporting that Israel is carrying out the crime of apartheid. B'Tselem, the prominent Israeli human rights group, says the same. Importantly, apartheid can be seen as both the consequence and the tool of historical Israel's settler colonial regime, and the two paradigms are not mutually exclusive. The term apartheid automatically conjures up the original manifestation of the system of domination, which is, in all of our minds, usually South Africa. Of course, Israel's practice of apartheid is not identical to what we saw throughout Southern Africa. There are similarities, obviously, but also differences. But today's apartheid stands as a crime in and of itself under international law, separate to the South African case, as it is. Apartheid in South Africa is now widely recognized as one of the gravest examples of a system of racist rule. It's come to be part of our common sense understanding of what racism can lead to, the worst of it, how it can manifest. It's a key era in African and world history. As a white supremacist state of the 20th century, formal apartheid lasted for almost 50 years in South Africa, held in place by a series of policies and practices that institutionalized white racial domination. Yet many, including those of us using apartheid South Africa as a term of reference, often know too little about what the system actually looked like, how it operated, and how and why it came to be historically developed. Further, there is little acknowledgement that white minority rule was not limited to South Africa in the 20th century, despite the fact that to its north, white racial domination was also practiced in the country formerly known as Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, for around 90 years there. This history is far less familiar, although it's just as important in comprehending how racist systems developed across Southern Africa, and also key, how they ended. Taking a comparative look at these systems and their similarities and differences through this broader regional lens will be a big part of our discussion today. Apartheid in South Africa and minority rule in Rhodesia can only be understood in the context of their colonial roots and the histories of colonial settlement. These deeper histories are often overlooked, leading to the impression that apartheid and white minority rule suddenly appeared out of abstract notions of hate and intolerance. But these histories are vital to understanding why and how such forms of racialized rule developed, and the ways in which ideas of race functioned and continue to function now. We should also remember that both the people of South Africa and Zimbabwe resisted these systems of violence and domination. These systems did not collapse of their own accord. The different forms that resistance took and how exactly apartheid and white minority rule came to an end is an important story to tell, as well as the contested claims as to how much has actually changed in each case. In this talk, we will bring these two threads together and look at the origins of apartheid and white supremacy in South Africa and Rhodesia, and how these systems developed and operated, but importantly, how they're brought to an end. With this background in mind, I am honored to invite Brian and Mandisi into the conversation. Thank you so much for being here today. So I'm going to start with questions. To start off, when did apartheid in South Africa or white rule in Rhodesia first start to be implemented, and by whom? What were they intended to achieve? So Mandisi, if you could go first, if that's okay, and then Brian, if you could follow.
Okay, I mean, so it's a historical fact that white racism was situated by European ships across the world, during the voyages of discovery. And the history of racism shows that apartheid, like other varieties of white racism in South Africa, was derived from a shared international literature deriving from European sources. For instance, the racist epithet kafir, which in post-apartheid South Africa is considered to be hate speech, is derived from Arabic, meaning non-believer or an infidel, but it was appropriated by the Portuguese during the Age of Discovery, who subsequently racialized it by linking it to black skin color in the 16th century. In the 17th century, white colonists in the Cape Colony used the term kefir as an important concept, to construct a racist knowledge system about blacks in South Africa. That racist knowledge system was based on the writings of European thinkers such as Richard Jobson, Jean Bodin, and John Bulwer. For instance, Jean Bodin described black people as lustful, whereas John Bulwer speculated that the origins of blackness in blacks originated from their apish desire. So between the 17th century till the end of apartheid in 1994, whites in South Africa further developed this racist knowledge system about blacks to give it a local sound and style, affording it a unique South African voice and grammar, to echo David Goldberg. Whites used this racist knowledge system to construct a slave society in the Cape of Good Hope from the 17th century to the early 19th century. When British Empire abolished slavery in 1834, a social group of white people in South Africa called Afrikaners in modern-day South Africa objected to this abolishment of slavery. To demonstrate their unhappiness with the abolishment of slavery, the Afrikaners seceded from the Cape of Good Hope and went on to establish their own Afrikaner republics. This historical event created a tension between the two white groups in South Africa, that is, the British and the Afrikaners. Violent conflict between these two white groups came to a head at the turn of the century in 1899, and it was exacerbated by the British economic interest in gold. And we refer to that conflict as the Anglo-Boer War. After the Anglo-Boer War in 1902, the British and the Afrikaners reconciled. Anthony Marx, the author of Making Race, a comparison of the United States, South Africa, and Brazil, concluded that, to consolidate their control over all of South Africa, the British Empire needed to make peace with the Afrikaners. And so an English-African or English-Black alliance was unthinkable as far as the British were concerned, but a white alliance with the Afrikaners seemed natural. White racism was used to unify whites and to build white nationalism, and thus to counter the intra-white conflict that had led to the Anglo-Boer War. And the post-Anglo-Boer War ushered in a new century with an organized and a much more collective white supremacist project in South Africa. This white racist project was framed around the colonial narrative of the white man's country. As far as whites were concerned, South Africa was not just a white man's country, but it was going to be a white working man's paradise. So through this racist ideology of white laborialism, a discursive synthesis of demands for social democracy and white supremacy, South African white workers helped create an exclusionary racial state founded on white racism. White racism in South Africa was a huge success. From 1910 until 1994, South African political life was almost entirely dominated by racist Afrikaner politicians. Although the Afrikaner racism is long-standing, it was powerfully expressed through the Apartheid system, which was instituted in 1948. George Frederickson, an American historian, has demonstrated that the Afrikaners' racist ideas attained their full ideological and institutional development in the 1950s after the introduction of apartheid. The apartheid state introduced racist segregation, which was entrenched within an all-embracing legal code and structured administration. In 1949, the South African Parliament passed the Mixed Marriages Act, prohibiting marriages between whites and people of color. The Population Registration Act, the formal classification of people according to color, also became law. A significant act often described as the most important cornerstone of apartheid, the Group Areas Act, became law in 1950, segregating, among other things, all the races into separate residential areas. Not only would blacks and whites live separate lives under apartheid, but the government consciously created an unequal society. For instance, the Reservation of Separate Amenities Act of 1953 stated that all races should have separate amenities such as toilets, parks, and beaches, and that these need not be of an equivalent quality. Blacks could not sit in the same seat as whites. Apartheid racist laws legislated inequality of education. It became criminal for blacks to receive the same education as whites. The law stated that blacks were to receive inferior education, whereas whites received world-class education. Under apartheid, school segregation, including universities, became total, and all cultural and sporting activities became entirely segregated. George Frederickson points out that although Hitler gave racism a bad name, South Africa's white supremacist state, the apartheid state, is the one racist regime that survived the Second World War and the Cold War. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Brian, if you'd like to go ahead.
Thank you very much. And I think the presentation really set out the broader context in which settler rule emerged in Southern Africa, specifically in what was Rhodesia. The prime agent of that was Cecil John Rose, at the time Premier of the Cape, a businessman in the diamond and gold industry. And with the expansion of British colonialism in the late 19th century, particularly after the Berlin Conference in 1884, Rhodesia was seen as a new possible area for gold and for land. And so the expansion north of Limpopo was considered part of this colonial ambition to move the project beyond South Africa. And so in the late 19th century, the 1880s, the Rhodes sent what was called the Pioneer Column into Rhodesia to carry out the colonial project. And the first thing that was done was was the meeting with the Ndebele Kingdom in the south of the country, and through that to engage in a series of duplicitous treaties, such as the Rad Concession, which effectively gave control to Rhodes and the British South Africa Company over land and mineral rights, but was done so in a duplicitous way, because it said to the king of Ndebele at the time, Lobengula, that this would only allow a limited number of people to mine on the land, but in effect, it was to allow him to have control of that land. Once that the treaty was signed, the Pioneer Column then moved north to Mashonaland in order to take over the Mashonaland province. Mashonaland province was considered less hostile, not as considered as effectively militarized as the Ndebele state. And so the movement into Mashonaland took over the control of the land and effectively the control of the people in that land. Now, the result of this was that then the people in Matabeleland and the Ndebele began to ask questions about what was going on. And there was therefore an initial uprising in 1893, which led to a series of conflicts. And of course, the British were overwhelmingly militarized with the Maxim gun. And in 1893, thousands were killed. And following that, a combined uprising of both Mashonaland and Matabeleland in 1896, 1997 led to a conflict with the colonial settlers. Now, there's lots of historiographical discussions about how unified this uprising was. Many have said it was much more disjointed, but nevertheless, the result was, as a result of both the war and the ravages of drought and hunger and disease, it's estimated that anywhere up to 20,000 people died between 1893 and 1896, 1897. That's one estimate of a recent scholar of a paper that will soon be out. Once this was done, of course, the idea was to extract gold and to control the land. Now, it turned out that there wasn't the kind of gold mine that they had in the Rand. And so they began to now give out land to settlers and to remove the indigenous people from their land and placing them into what we call reserves, pushing them off their land and giving it to the new colonists. This, of course, led to a great deal of new forms of coercive labor, expropriation, taxes on cattle, on labor, coerced labor, and it changed, therefore, the structures in which people were used to living, and enforced a new form of domination. And it was, of course, legitimated through the idea of bringing civilization to the uncivilized natives, and that the blacks were seen as the white man's burden, who had to be guided into white civilization. And this was the basis on which the exploitative move into Rhodesia took place. This, of course, then set the standard for 1923. The British South African Company was given control of the Rhodesian colony by the British Empire, who had been there to assist with the suppression of the local people. And hence, following that, the British South African Company then proceeded to set in place forms of rule which would identify blacks as natives and those who lived in the city, whites, as citizens. Now, this, of course, was never that rigid a dichotomy, because even people who were considered natives always fought for their civic rights as well, right from the beginning. There was never that bifurcation. But they put into place racialized laws of where you could live, that you could live only in certain areas, in the towns, the townships, in the rural areas, in reservations, whereas whites were allowed to own their own farms. The state effectively owned the communal, the reserve lands, and these were put under traditional. They reinvented the idea of traditional leadership of the local population, and that was put under a native administration, which effectively controlled the rural areas. Jobs, of course, were segregated. Certain jobs were placed for blacks and whites. In between that, they had what they call the colored race, which are people of mixed race, who were given certain more rights, but were also discriminated against. Effectively, they also had a miscegenation law, as in South Africa, which banned relations between black and whites. So the idea was, again, to set out this racialized form of rule or form of livelihoods, form of life, which would impose the British version of civilization on the natives of Rhodesia. And that, of course, took form right from the 1920s until the independence in 1980. And in between that, what you had was different changes in that form of rule. From the British South African Company, you move towards self-rule in self-rule in 1923, and then a federal system in the 1950s, where there was an attempt to liberalize somewhat some of those racialized rules. That fell apart very quickly. That federal system was supposed to include Zimbabwe, so Rhodesia, Northern Rhodesia, and Malawi. But it fell apart partly because of the growing opposition to white rule. A growing opposition which took various forms from the early days, whether it was strikes on the mines, urban growing trade union movements in the 40s and the 50s, residents' associations in the urban areas, and the growing struggles over land, particularly after the Land Apportionment Act in 1930, which effectively gave control of the most fruitful land to the white population. And this resistance grew from the 1950s until the 60s, when the nationalist movements emerged in a much stronger form. And that led increasingly, because the white Rhodesian state was unwilling to accept any form of democratic political participation, led to a liberation war in the 1960s and the 70s, a liberation war which effectively placed fighters fighting from the neighboring countries which had become independent, whether it was Mozambique or Zambia, trained in Tanzania. And these forces gathered in different parties. There was divisions within the nationalist movement from its inception. It was never one unified movement. But nevertheless, those military forces grew. And because there was a simple acceptance that this regime would not give up power without the use of force. There was no way it was going to step back from its racialized privilege rule to allow Black people to become citizens in their own right. And this fight for independence was about citizenry. It was about democratic participation. It was about one person, one vote. It was the right to a dignified lifestyle, a dignified humanity. And that's what drove the impetus of the liberation struggle, notwithstanding the conflicts that were taking place within the liberation movements themselves, which were to play out in later years in the post-independence period, which I'll talk about later. But yeah, I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. It's really interesting what you both said about race. Mandisi, you mentioned that apartheid was a way to unify white people together. And Brian, you also talked about this like new form of domination. However, I know that in Zimbabwe or in Rhodesia at the time, a lot of the conceptions of race was very exclusionary and very British. So even with the ideas of whiteness, that was in flux even there. So kind of on that note, keeping that difference in mind, could you both tell us about the significance of these notions of race in constructing these systems of white supremacy, and how were the ideas of whiteness and blackness and proximity to either of these conceived and made into a system? Brian, if you could go first, and then Mandisi.
Sure.
Thank you.
Well, as you said, there was no initial unified form of whiteness. Whiteness is a construction, as in other identities. It takes different forms over different times. And for a long period of time, the being British was considered to be the most white. Those who were Afrikaners or Jews or Southern Europeans, in a sense, had to fight for their whiteness, had to fight to claim that whiteness. It wasn't something that was simply given. It was something that had to be fought for within the white community. And so part of the establishment of white rule was building up this consensus of whiteness and bringing in different groupings of white people into that construction of the white population. And that, I think, was a contested notion pretty much throughout the colonial period. In terms of the black side, similarly, there was never one idea of blackness. There were differences within different ethnic groupings, which followed the liberation movement, the nationalist politics in both the colonial and the post-colonial period. There were also class differences emerging in both white and black communities, which also played out. And therefore, what the nationalist movement, one of their major challenges was to develop an identity of national unity, to try and get a construction of unity within the black community, because there was this understanding that that was not there. And one of the things that was done was to draw on the uprisings of the late 19th century against the British colonial rule, and to draw on figures of the first Chimurenga, as it was then called, as signifying that was a unified struggle against the British. And now for us to come together as different ethnic groups, we also have to draw on that legacy of unity, even though that unity was always problematic within the black community. So drawing a legitimizing narrative from a history of unity or perceived unity was then used as part of the nationalist movement to build that unity. But also, nationalist parties used coercion to bring people into their structures. That the internal battles within nationalist movements about who was in control, which leadership, which ethnic groupings were in control, were central to the history of nationalism. It was always fraught with divisions, fraught with internal cleavages, and as much as the emphasis on trying to build a coercive unity, force and coercion within the liberation and nationalist movements was also a factor in trying to build that unified racial identity or national identity of being Zimbabwean, a problematic that we saw exacerbated in the post-colonial period. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Mandisi, if you could go ahead.
Okay, so the racializing knowledge about Africans and other people of color has historically played a very significant role in constructing white racism in South Africa. Whites used racist knowledge systems, to order a slave society in the Cape of Good Hope. The racial polity that whites established in the Cape encouraged white slave owners to generally prefer so-called half-breed slaves of European descent. According to Robert Shaw, a South African historian, the so-called half-breed slaves of European descent were racially ranked higher than any full-breed slave from any region. Furthermore, Gary Taylor explained that the social acceptance of slavery by whites was based on this racializing logic that created boundaries between those who could and those who could not be enslaved. David Goldberg adds that whiteness was associated with civilization and superiority, Politically, whiteness stood for power and control, and economically, whiteness stood for slave ownership and property ownership. Blackness, on the other hand, stood for backwardness, primitiveness, savagery, and barbarism. Politically, Europeans viewed Africa as presenting the problems of Hobbes, that is, chaos and disorder, problems that Europeans claimed only they could solve in order to take advantage of the opportunities of Locke, that is, the creation of nation-state, commerce, and trade, according to John E. Canberry. Moreover, it was said that since Africans lived in a state of nature, that gave whites the right to rule over Africans. This was considered to be the white man's burden. Historically, whiteness in South Africa has been used as a race-making ideology. It has been used as a slave-making ideology, and it was used to construct an exploitative and racist system in the form of slavery and apartheid state that favored whites. In short, throughout the history of South Africa, whites used white racism to perpetuate a racial order that distributed life chances, social status, wealth, and power along racial lines. For instance, during the last quarter of the 19th century, South Africa entered a long period of rapid industrial growth, which transformed South Africa from an agricultural economy into an industrial economy. And the industrialization of the economy in South Africa contributed to the growth of poor whites and poor blacks as well. And poor whites, like poor blacks, were forced to move to the new industrial cities in search of work. Research shows that because of their lack of training, both black and white workers had to compete for unskilled jobs that were available. However, white colonial government became very anxious about what they regarded as they termed it poor white problem. It is reported that the colonial government worried that the poor white problem could lead to the destruction of white rule in South Africa. Hence the government resolved to eliminate white poverty. It was concluded that to maintain white control, the national aim should be the enrollment of every white child of school age, according to David Beckham. In addition, the colonial government developed a wide array of white rehabilitation programs designed to ensure that poor whites would be absorbed into the economy at levels above poor blacks, thus creating a white labor aristocracy, explains David Beckham. The system of separate and superior education for whites formed the early centerpiece of the rehabilitation policy. Racist white labor unions lobbied the industries to hire whites. In her PhD, Tiffany Wilbur-Herod argues that poor white laborers claim that they were denied the liberty of white existence, that is, to thrive and progress. In response, the white government insisted that Indian and black railway workers be retrenched in favor of hiring white workers. As far as whites were concerned, they were the legitimate beneficiaries of wealth generated by gold and diamonds in South Africa. In the mining industry, white miners did the better paid and skilled work and left the unskilled work to a large low-wage African workforce. History shows that white racism was not imposed on white South Africans. For instance, white residents of Amalinde, a town in the Eastern Cape in South Africa, lobbied successfully in 1955 to have their suburb declared a white group area. Okay, I think I'll stop there.
Thank you both. That was really, really helpful, really insightful. The next question kind of takes into account what you both have done really well, which is to stress the fact that these systems were more than just laws, more than just structures, but there were lived experiences when it came to people's jobs, when it came to people's livelihoods. Mandisi talked about existence as a personal white existence being progress itself. So kind of on that note, what did apartheid and white rule look like on the ground in terms of how they operated? Did the systems change at all with time? We have mentioned it briefly before, but more detail on that would be amazing. Did they change with time, or did they largely stay the same? Was there a through flow through all of it? Mandisi, if you could go first, and then Brian.
Okay, so according to historians, the apartheid government designed and constructed the most comprehensive racist regime meant to be a permanent structure that the world had ever seen. According to Anthony Marx, the South African apartheid was more centrally imposed and pervasive than was Jim Crow segregation and exclusion in the more centralized post-Reconstruction United States. So, for example, the South African Land Act of 1913 allocated 87% of the land to whites and 13% to blacks. And the Land Act made it illegally for blacks to purchase land in what was considered to be white South Africa. The 1913 Immigrant Regulation Act denied citizenship to virtually all African people. But to ensure the supply of labor to the mining industry and commercial agriculture, the state included an exemption clause in that Immigration Regulation Act, which stated that Black Africans could only officially enter white South Africa as contract workers or unofficially as undocumented migrants. The 1923 Native Urban Areas Act was introduced with the sole purpose of surveilling and policing blacks who were working and living in urban areas. Urban areas were considered to be white spaces in South Africa. And the Native Urban Areas Act empowered more white municipalities to establish racially segregated locations for blacks and to criminalize blacks in white areas. The Native Urban Areas Act reaffirmed the requirement that African males on entering a white area to report and obtain a pass, allowing them to stay and seek work. The New York Times described the pass, it's like a passport, but it was called a pass. The New York Times described the pass as a book that contained a very condensed history of the Black person's life, including his birthplace, legal place of residence, employment, tax payment, and marital status. To be caught without a pass was a criminal offense. Under the Proclamation number 50 of 1934, no African without a pass could be employed, and the employer was required to demand the pass and retain it in his possession until the end of period of service, when it would be returned with the date of discharge. From 1950 onward, the pass laws were used to exclude blacks from South African citizenship. Through pass laws, Black South Africans were forcibly removed from what the apartheid government deemed to be white areas, and they were moved to the Bantustans. And Bantustans were basically fictitious black countries that the apartheid government dreamt up. The historical record shows that in the late 1960s, the building of family housing for blacks in urban areas was frozen. And that is the origin of so many shacks in South Africa today. In 1968, labor regulations were introduced to prevent contract black workers from obtaining Section 10 rights. The so-called Section 10 rights offered protection against arrest and deportation from white South Africa. According to Michael Savage, a South African academic, the apartheid government policy stated that blacks, quote here, are only temporarily resident in the European areas of the Republic for as long as they offer their labor there. But as soon as they become, for some reason or other, no longer fit for work in the labor market, they are expected to return to the Bantustans, close quote. Racist South African laws were so effective in channeling blacks to the Bandustan that by the 1980, some 53% of the black South African population were forced to live in the Bandustans. Research shows that racist policies implemented by white governments in South Africa denied more than 80% of the nation full access to citizenship and human rights. Michael Savage argues that between 1916 and 1986, more than 22 million black South Africans were individually arrested, prosecuted, or physically removed from areas by the South African state in its effort to impose the past laws and other apartheid laws on the black population. The past laws were a key part of the racist legal administrative apparatus aimed at maintaining an exclusive white citizenship and white domination. According to the 1978 New York Times report, the racist past laws in South Africa were at the root of every social problems afflicting the black community, from poverty, family breakup, alcoholism, crime, among other things. To paraphrase David Goldberg, the apartheid state was a white supremacist state which was molded in the image of whiteness to reflect the interests of whites. The apartheid state was a white supremacist state where whites could freely practice their white racism and accumulate wealth at the expense of blacks. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Anjisi. That was really great. Brian, if you could go ahead.
Thank you. I think the Rhodesian whites drew on the experience of South Africa a great deal in trying to create segregated systems in Zimbabwe, or Rhodesia as it then was. For example, as already been said, the Land Apportionment Act in 1930 effectively gave the majority of productive land to whites and confined the rest of the population to native reserves. Within the urban areas, similarly, you could only, if you were black, come into urban work if you had a pass, an urban pass, and you were considered a temporary worker in the urban areas. You were not considered part of any permanent feature of the urban structure. And the Urban Areas Act of 1954 tried to enforce that in very difficult ways. Of course, this attempt to enforce these laws was always something that was fought, that was always problematic, because despite the imposition of these past laws and the segregated forms of living, people fought to stay in the urban areas. Women fought to survive there. Women are not supposed to be there on a permanent basis, but they carried out their own informal activities in the township areas, brewing beer and other activities in order to survive. Trade unions fought for broader citizenship rights to ensure that the rights of workers in the city could be expanded. So this attempt to segregate was never something that was simply accepted. Of course, the Rhodesian state also used state funds to support white business, both in agriculture, but also in mining and in manufacturing. So the economy was built around state support for the elite white sector in controlling the formal sector of the economy. And so those who came into the urban areas, blacks, had to work in very precarious jobs for precarious wages, and where they were never allowed to move up the employment ladder. And this began to change a little during the Federation period, but not much. But once UDI was declared in 1965, the Unilateral Declaration of Independence, which the Smith regime stated now that this was a white-led country which would be there for 1,000 years, which was Smith's dream. This would be live for 1,000 years. This was an attempt to solidify the rule of whites, the livelihoods of whites, the segregation of races in the rural and in the urban areas, to segregation of job possibilities, education, social lives. And this, of course, as I said, led to increasing conflicts on the ground. Not only the growth of nationalist movements, which emerged in the 1960s, which were then banned. Many nationalists were imprisoned because of their activities. Trade unionists were also imprisoned. There was attempts to control the trade union movement, to place it under state control, to ensure that it didn't get out of hand in that sense, and that the civic sphere, the public sphere, was one, and including the media, was controlled by state-controlled media, and therefore the entire political sphere was one which was polarized, and where the idea of white rule as being able to last for 30 years was constantly put on the agenda. But just to reiterate, as I said, despite these different forms of segregation, and as I said, much of it drawn from the apartheid experience and applied to the Rhodesian context, for example, in the urban areas, using the taxing of urban workers in order to, through beer halls, in order to pay for urban services, so that the white taxpayer would not have to suffer. Those kind of things had to segregate the forms of life that were always and consistently opposed by different forces within Rhodesian society, leading to the liberation struggle, which we saw from the late 60s into the 1970s. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you both. I'm sure that there's a lot that we are hearing, especially in the audience, that is sounding familiar when it comes to talk about Bantustans or reserves and what we look at now happening in Palestine, in the West Bank, the idea of past systems of use of labor without the benefits of work, all of those kinds of things. Let that be a reminder to you, please, to submit questions. There is the bar at the bottom of your screen right now. Send them in. If you don't have a specific question, look at what's there, vote on what you would like, and we'll answer them in a bit. So to continue from there, we have, again, spoken about the fact of just constant extraction of labor, forcing Black labor and non-white labor into a white capitalist system, and essentially using it to subsidize the lifestyles of colonialists. Obviously, despite this conviction that this was the right way to be and this was the correct way, that the only way to exist, we've seen that it's fallen. So with that hopefulness in mind, what kinds of opposition and resistance did these systems face over time? When did they really start to weaken, and why did they? Brian, if you could go first, and then Mandisi.
Yeah, the opposition to colonial rule existed through most of the colonial period, starting in the first centuries of the 20th century with urban mine strikes in the urban mines. In the 40s and 50s, struggles around land, which emerged as well. The trade union struggles of the 50s, which brought to the fore the issue of labor rights within the country. But then increasingly the realization that none of these peaceful forms of resistance would bring down the system led to the idea that the only way to confront settler colonial racism was to go to war. And therefore the nationalist parties, which emerged in the early 60s, moved from attempts at peaceful resistance, negotiations, peaceful protests, to receiving support from outside the country, from outside countries like Russia and China, to train their guerrillas and to fight the Rhodesian regime. And once countries around the region became independent, they then provided bases from which the guerrillas could come in and fight the Rhodesian regime, whether it was in Mozambique and in Zambia in particular. But it was really in the late 70s a kind of convergence of issues which really led to the weakening of the Rhodesian system. And this convergence was, one, the internal struggles of the nationalists the Liberation War, to a growing regional pressure for change. And this regional pressure was coming from the states, the regional independent states. Even South Africa, at that time, pressure was put on South Africa, the apartheid state, by the Western countries to put pressure on Ian Smith to go and negotiate. And that pressure was put on Ian Smith. And so this combination of national struggle, regional pressures, and also the regional governments like Mozambique and Zambia also wanted the war to end. So they were pushing for a dialogue. And the pressure on Rhodesia from the South Africans and from the Western countries pushed all these forces towards the negotiations in Lancaster at 1979. So a combination of factors, not just one issue, led to this weakening of this system. And that's something to keep in mind always, I think, for other struggles, that it's never just one factor. It's always a combination, especially when your struggle is linked to regional politics and into international politics. At the time, of course, it was linked to the Cold War, and there was the fear in the Western countries that any prolonged struggles would lead to radicalization of nationalist movements and moves towards the communist bloc. And therefore, that also influenced the West's position on putting pressure on South Africa to get Smith to the table. In the current context, the pressures are different, but those international and regional issues are key in understanding the weakening of the system in Rhodesia. I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mandisi. Whenever you're ready.
Okay. So Black South Africans have resisted white supremacy since the 18th century. From the late 18th century, Black people in the Eastern Cape of South Africa violently opposed the white colonial project. According to Donovan Williams, a South African historian, between the years 1819 and 1953, they emerged a sense of closer nationalism in the Eastern Cape, and the so-called frontier wars between blacks and the British Empire in the 19th century further radicalized blacks in the Eastern Cape. When the British finally subjugated blacks in the Eastern Cape at the end of the 19th century, independent black churches emerged, to challenge whiteness. The independent black churches in South Africa then reached out, to Black American churches in the United States of America. Charles Johnson argues in his PhD that the affiliation between independent black churches in South Africa and the Black American churches engendered a communication nexus between African Americans and Black South Africans that permitted the exchange of information regarding each other's circumstances. Johnson argues that Black American churches helped develop Black South African leadership that shaped Black political dissent throughout the 20th century. The independent Black churches were often in the forefront of Black political activity in the early 20th century South Africa. White South Africans, particularly white missionaries, regarded the independent Black churches as being anti-white. The affiliation between the independent Black churches in South Africa and the Black American churches also contributed to a large number of South Africans going to the United States to study. Prominent Black political figures who studied in the US and were influenced by Black American thought include John Dube, the first president of the African National Congress, including two of Dube's successors, that would be Pixley Sime and Alfred Numa, as well as Charlotte Macleke, who became the founder of the women's branch of the African National Congress. In the 1920s, Garveyism shaped Black South African politics. Garveyism particularly influenced the politics of the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union in South Africa. However, throughout the 20th century, the African National Congress played a dominant role in organizing Black politics. the African National Congress was founded in 1911, and initially it did not reject British imperialism, but because the leaders of the African National Congress were products of white missionary schools, and they believed in this notion of white liberalism. And so these leaders looked to Britain for support against African and racism, according to Drew Allison. And prior to 1940, the African National Congress was very much constrained, by the influence of Christianity and white liberalism. Cecil Badenhorst argues in his PhD that during this period, the ANC was driven by the white liberal ideology of cooperation and dialogue, and this was acted out through a spate of European and African conferences that took place between 1923 and 1936. However, the intensification of white racism, which culminated with the establishment of a white supremacist state in 1948, convinced some Black activists that white liberalism was not an appropriate tool to fight the white supremacist state. In this context, Black radicals considered the idea of a Black united front to fight white racism. Thus, Black radicals within the African National Congress resolved to form what they call the ANC Youth League. And the new Black radicals within the ANC Youth League were less likely to accept the white liberal appeals of equality through passive cooperation. The ANC Youth League began by injecting a strongly racial conception of African nationalism that stood to counter the white Western civilization. Furthermore, the ANC's the ANC Youth League political ideology was influenced by two strands of thought, that is, Garveyism and what Alton Drew terms a moderate Africanist stream. These two political traditions within the ANC disagreed on the political role that was to be played by white activists and white communists within the ANC. The Garveyists within the African National Congress believed in the Garveyism political philosophy of Africans shaping their own political destination, and to that end, a development of Africa for the Africans political movement. However, the Garveyists were purged from the ANC in the late 1950s, and that led to the formation of the Pan-Africanist Congress. In 1960, the ANC was declared illegal by the Apartheid state and was therefore banned. After being outlawed, the ANC formed Umkhonto weSizwe to fight against apartheid, utilizing guerrilla warfare and sabotage, basically armed struggle. In 1964, Nelson Mandela, then a deputy president of the ANC, was convicted, along with several other ANC leaders, to life in prison. Between 1969 and 1972, Steve Biko articulated Black politics that would eventually be termed Black consciousness philosophy. According to Biko, Blacks in South Africa had to stop relying on white liberalism for their liberation. Like Frantz Fanon and other Black liberation thinkers, Steve Biko was fully committed to the liberation of Black people. The apartheid state murdered Biko in 1977. The Black consciousness movement in South Africa later inspired the United Democratic Front, which was founded in 1983. The United Democratic Front was a mass non-racial anti-apartheid political movement. So it was the combination of these political movements and international solidarity that led to the demise of the apartheid state. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you. That was great from both of you. One thing that I found, interesting and obviously relevant, you both really stressed the multifacetedness of resistance, the many faces of it, the many fronts within the struggle, and on communities, communication between groups in various places, and solidarities. I'm interested also in the constraints of liberalism, and white liberalism at that. Brian, you spoke about the Lancaster House agreements. Arguably that was a constraining force. When we came to liberation, it was designed, at least in part, to protect settlers and to push back the idea of return of land to the indigenous, etc., etc. And Mandisi also, arguably, in South Africa, the system of removing apartheid or deconstructing it was a concession on the part of the apartheid government as opposed to a grassroots rebuilding. So keeping that in mind, what are the changes that we have seen in Zimbabwe and South Africa with the formal ending of these systems? Are there continuities as well? Brian, if you could go first, Mandisi after that, if that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, certainly there's continuities and changes. The first change, first of all, you're right. The Lancaster House Constitution was not only a device to provide majority rule, but to protect the interests of the minority, particularly the property interests of the minority. But once it also opened up democratic spaces in the post-independence period for people to vote, for people to participate more publicly in the public sphere, for people to move into certain sectors of the economy that they couldn't move into. But the legacies, the structural legacies of Rhodesian rule also limited the opportunities because the private sector was very much in the hands of the white community. The new state, the new national state, which was run by ZANU and part also at the time in the unified government with ZAPU, they also were worried about having an independent business class which was independent of the ruling party. They always wanted a business elite which they could control as well. So part of the problem was not just only the structural limitations of the colonial period, but the political project of the new state, which wanted to ensure that any new business class would be close to them and be controlled by them. And of course, the land question. There was some movement on the land under the willing seller, willing buyer period, and there was some funding for land reform. But also with the emergence of the increasing frustration over the lack of expansion within the economy, you had a growing opposition emerging. And this particularly took place during the neoliberal period of the 1990s, when the economy really went into a decline. And so you had in the 1990s the emergence of an opposition built around the combination of trade unions, churches, a middle class, which began to demand a new constitution, which was written by Zimbabweans without outside influence. And so you had the demand for constitutional reform and the worry that ZANU-PF was moving towards a one-party state. And that was becoming particularly apparent by the late 1980s. Once this opposition emerged in the form of the MGC, there was a growing threat to the nationalist rule. And in 2000, after a long debate and struggle over constitutional reform from 1997-98, where the constitutional movement began to lead the debate away from ZANU-PF towards the citizenry. There was the fact that the new MDC did so well in the 2000 elections raised fears within the ruling party that it could actually lose power. And so what we saw in the post-2000 period was a number of issues. One was the land reform issue came onto the agenda again. It never left the agenda. From the 1980s, 1990s, there were always pressures from communities for land reform. But in the face of this growing opposition, the state and its allies, particularly the war veterans, pushed for a more radical land reform, which meant taking over white farms. And so in the 2000s, we saw an extremely radical land reform program, the effects of which we are still feeling today. There's much debate about the pros and cons of it, but effectively it changed the ownership structure of land. It pushed off white farmers. It gave more land to small farm owners, but also gave big control to ruling elites. But along with this land reform program came a new authoritarian nationalist politics that, combined with this radical land reform program, the ruling party reconstructed into a much more authoritarian, repressive regime, where they systematically set out to attack opposition parties, civil society forces. They used a narrative of unity, which meant unity under ZANU-PF or nothing else. It was a very selective form of unity. And this indication of authoritarianism was already apparent in the 1980s during the Gukuraunde massacres, where the ruling party went after its opposition, ZAPU, and really carried out mass murders in Matabeleland and the Midlands. So there was already an indication in the early years that we could move in this direction. But by the 2000s, the state itself had become increasingly unprofessionalized and increasingly repressive, and the closing down of space, of democratic civic space, media space, became increasingly apparent. Elections were both violent and rigged, and there was consistent contestations over elections from the 2000s. And this really is what marked. And from the coup in 2017, when Mugabe was removed, there's been a deepening militarization of the state in all its forms, during the state, in state structures, in the manner in which elections are carried out, the control of the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, and a blatant militarization of the ruling party and the state. And so the democratic space in Zimbabwe is increasingly narrowing. And so ironically, we're moving towards some of the politics of the colonial period, where we're seeing a closing down of state by a ruling party that perceives itself as having legitimacy in perpetuity, and a systematic attempt to destroy opposition forces through the use of the judiciary, through the use of force and repression, and through the use of legislation, such as the incoming Private Voluntary Organization Acts, which will effectively police the activities of civil society, and a threatened Patriot Act, which will make it illegal for any Zimbabwean to talk to a foreign country against the Zimbabwe government. So the closure of space is beginning to resemble the colonial era. So the lesson here is that even when you get independence, there's no guarantees of the kind of freedoms that you fought for, that you see corruption, and we're seeing it in South Africa, state capture and corruption now. The ANC is going through its own existential problems at the moment. But post-colonial liberation parties face major challenges in understanding the idea of giving up power if they lose elections, and because that will mean they have to give up their access to the state, which is the center of accumulation for their corrupt activities. And that presents a major new series of challenges for post-colonial citizens. Thank you.
Okay.
No,
go on.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So George Ferguson, an American historian, has pointed out that the blacks now in power in South Africa cannot, given the resources at their command, adequately compensate blacks for 3.5 centuries of exploitation and racism to the extent that would be required to make them truly equal to the whites. Hence, for example, the government land audit in 2017 showed that whites own the majority of land in South Africa, still at 72%, followed by coloreds at 15%, Indians at 5%, and Africans at 4%. According to Thomas Piketty, the top 10 share of total income in South Africa still goes to whites mostly. Piketty concluded that even today, if you look at the data, especially within the top 1% to 5%, it will be up to 80% white. And that shows that, though things have changed a little bit, but, the racial inequality in South Africa is largely the legacy of apartheid and white racism. Research shows no sign of decreasing racialized wealth inequality since 1994 or since the end of apartheid. Research by South African academics show high levels of racialized inequality in South Africa that can be accounted for in all kinds of assets at the top end, including housing, pension funds, and other financial assets. According to Statistics South Africa, Black households have the highest unemployment at more than 46%, with just fewer than 10% of whites unemployed. Even when Blacks are employed, they receive the lowest wages, while whites earn 3 times more than Blacks on average. Post-apartheid South Africa is, by and large, still racially segregated. For instance, some white Afrikaners established their own white town in 1991, and they called it Orania. 31 years later, Orania is still exclusively white and Afrikaans. Afrikaners who live in Orania claim that Orania is not a racial compound, but a cultural place to preserve Afrikaner culture and history. Whites in Orania say they are for the expression of Afrikaans culture rather than using racializing labels such as apartheid or Bandustans. In Orania, white politics of racial divisiveness are expressed via the commemoration of white supremacists like Verwoerd. For instance, Orania statue garden commemorates white supremacists who either served as midwives to the birth of the apartheid system or were the overseers of one of the most egregious crimes against humanity, the apartheid system. Orania's statue garden is a constellation of unreconstructed white racists whose anti-Black racist worldviews were unbending. These include, Hans Stradom, the F. Malan, H.F. Verwoerd, J.B.M. Herzog, and Paul Kruger. And Orania is basically just a very good example of how whites still, try to perpetuate and preserve the idea of a white homeland, the idea of racial segregation, and by and large, and whites who don't live in places like Orania, pretty much still live in their own racial enclaves, their own sort of racial white suburbs, behind high security walls and so on and so forth. And even in schools that are supposed to be integrated, Black students pretty much hang out together, and white students hang out, by themselves and so on. And they only, students only interact when they have to in class or when they're playing sports, but no friendships, are developed in these spaces outside of school. So yes, white racism in South Africa is still a very much disruptive force. So I'll stop there.
No, thank you both. You made really great points about the challenges that we do face and will be facing with the contamination of nationalism and our visions within a capitalist system, within a continued Eurocentric, white-oriented system. I can, like all three of us, I suppose I can speak firsthand on trying to navigate the kind of cultural segregations that are based then on economic divides that have these centuries of history, and trying to figure out how to grapple with deconstructing those again. So thank you. That was really, really wonderful. We are going to go to questions, if that's okay. Thank you so much for all of your questions to the audience. We won't be able to get through all of them. However, we will be sending resources out after the event. So hopefully what you ask will be covered in those resources. So to begin, Brian and Mandisi, what do you think, or rather, why do you think that so little attention is given to the shared struggles of the Palestinians and, in this case, Southern Africans, especially considering the fact that Theodore Herzl sought to model the British South Africa's tactics and strategies in Palestine? Do you think that the mainstreaming of the apartheid narrative now creates the space necessary to explore it further and to do this more often? Brian, if you could go first, and then Mandisi.
Yeah, look, I think that the politics of Israel has its own specificities. There are similarities, there are particularities, but obviously the international context as well is very different. They have very strong support from major players at the international level, which is able to define the terms of the discussion, the terms of the debate in many ways, in ways that the apartheid state did not, had less control over, where you had increasingly an international project around anti-apartheid, and which took a strong form in terms of people's support, but also growing countries who criticized the apartheid regime, including the UN, of course, which we're not seeing with regard to what's going on with the Palestinian question. One would hope that these comparisons allow for a broader discussion. I'm sure even, there are internal discussions going on within the Palestinian movements, within Israeli politics around these questions. But hopefully this broader comparative analysis will show that there are issues which can be drawn on and learned from what happens to post-apartheid states, and that you can't solve this problem simply by persistently repressing populations. That there has to be a better way forward, a better form of dialogue, which can bring forth a more peaceful settlement and a more just settlement. And that's a challenge even for post-liberation countries in the region. As I said in my own presentation, it's not enough just to have independence, because oftentimes the liberation parties bring with them conceptions of politics which they've inherited from the colonial state, and they themselves have problems with democratization, huge problems. And so the struggles here in Southern Africa are far from over, not only around racism and racist accumulation and privilege, but also around the rights of people basically to have the right to vote without being violently treated. After 42 years, the national slogan of one man, one vote is still a problem in Zimbabwe. You can't go to vote without wondering, first of all, whether you're going to be beaten or starved of food, or whether your vote is going to be properly counted. And so it's those kind of basic issues which can be learned from in a broader context.
Okay, so I think with regards to framing, Israel as an apartheid state, I think Israel really resists that narrative and that framing, and Israel uses all its resources, to make sure, that framing does not stick through propaganda and other means, and I think by and large, a mainstream society in Western countries is also not very much receptive, to that framing. This is constantly questioned, and constantly really sort of downplayed and so on. Yeah, so there's this intellectual struggle, that's needed, to really push that, that narrative and defend it and circulate it. With regards to the support that Israel receives, I agree with Brian. Even though apartheid, South Africa was, apartheid South Africa was pretty much supported by the American government right throughout, because the Americans, saw apartheid South Africa really as a bulwark against communism, in Southern Africa and in Africa, and that's why apartheid South Africa was sent soldiers to fight in Angola, Mozambique, and just throughout, just causing havoc throughout Southern Africa, and that was with the support of Americans, who wanted to disrupt what's going on in the DRC with the killing of Lumumba and so on. And so South Africa was a very useful ally for Americans. But in the end, that support sort of waned, and then and that sort of facilitated the demise of apartheid as well. And so I'm hoping, maybe, I don't know if I'm being realistic, I'm hoping maybe one day something similar could happen in Israel. But to be honest, I don't know. I really don't know. And there's also another aspect to the Israeli occupation of Palestine. The religious aspect. So which also tends to complicate the situation. But people who study the history of Palestine, and they point out that for centuries the Jews and Palestinians lived side by side without any problems. So yeah, I'm hopeful, but I don't know.
No, I think the doubts are natural, and what I at least have got from both of you guys' presentations is a really strong sense of belief that these very detailed descriptions that you gave of the challenges that our countries have respectively faced was overturned. And I feel that, these conversations were being had in the 70s and 60s, and people were, doubts were good because it leads us to the answers, essentially, and to learning from each other's struggles. So thank you both for those, and bringing that up as well, Mandisi. Secondly, could I ask you whether you could touch on the issue of gender in the context of this topic? Like, how does gender interact with white supremacy? Like, how does patriarchy, bounce off of white supremacy? I know it's a big question, but however you can, Mandisi, and then Brian, if that's okay.
Okay, so in South Africa, gender, especially with regards to white women, so white women were constructed, theoretically and ideologically, by white racists as really, gatekeepers to a white nation, and so from that narrative, then it was argued that, it was the responsibility of the white state, was a responsibility of white men, to protect white women from interacting and socializing with blacks, and then white racists created a narrative that basically said that it was necessary for the government to actually criminalize any kind of interracial sex, because this would lead to the demise of the white race in South Africa, because through this racial mixing, this will dilute the blood of whites, and so on and so forth. And it was argued that to begin with, any decent white woman didn't want to be involved with black people, and the white men who got involved with black people were either they were crazy, or they were raped, or they were coerced, and so this discussion took place within this narrative of a black peril. So the black peril here was this a narrative that basically argued that black men were out to rape white women. This happened in between the 1900s to the 1920s, but it had happened in Natal in the late 19th century as well. And interestingly, this is the same period that we see lynching taking place in America, and where they're using more or less the same kind of narrative, from late 19th century in America to the 1920s. So the same thing is happening in South Africa, but in South Africa, there are no lynching, largely because the state take everything, in its own hand, and basically deals with black people by implementing all kinds of racist laws, and by hanging, accused black rapists, and so on and so forth. So that's the difference between the lynching in America and the black peril narrative in South Africa. But also that narrative, we see it happening in Germany, after the First World War, with the stationing of black military troops in Germany in the Rhine there, white Germans, white elite begin to create this narrative of the so-called black shame. And it's the same kind of narrative that, they were arguing that, these black military soldiers on the Rhine were raping poor white German women and so on. And this was a worldwide campaign. And these campaigns are all happening more or less at the same, same time, during the same time period. And in South Africa, this anxiety of interracial sex is really a driving force behind racial segregation, residential segregation, and really it's like a dominant theme throughout the 20th century South Africa. But it's the kind of a theme that's not been adequately interrogated by historians, largely because history of South Africa is written by liberal white men, and who have different interests, and like labor and so on and so forth, which is fine, but there are other aspects to South African history. So so gender really plays a very important role in the creation of white racism in South Africa. That's the bottom line.
Thank you. Brian, if you could go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I think Mandisi set out that very well. Just to add that one of the things, of course, while black men were not allowed to interact with white women, white men could do so with black women. And of course, the outcome of that, colored children were often taken away from their black mothers and placed in certain schools where their fathers didn't have to have any responsibility for them, and they didn't get to know their black mothers, often never or till late in life. One of the real tragedies of the Miscegenation Act and the racialized politics around women. But to come to black women as well, there was almost an alliance between traditional black patriarchs and the colonial state about controlling black women, because the traditional leaders often didn't want women to leave the villages to go into the towns. They wanted to keep them in the villages, and women often wanted to get away from those traditional structures, to get into towns, to be able to make their own way. And so the often traditional leaders were supported by the white colonial structure in dominating women and keeping them in their place. But of course, as I said, often women fought back at that and went into the cities and carried out their own activities and did their own thing, whether as selling beer illegally, or sex workers, or any kind of activity they could carry out, domestic work, but always as a kind of very precarious existence. And so the gender issue also has carried on in the post-colonial period. There's a great deal of gender abuse and now in Zimbabwe, a lot of problems around child marriages, which is a real issue emerging in the context of the precariousness of livelihoods, where often also families are basically selling their children to church leaders as well as for some form of income. So the genderization of politics is certainly not gone away, and in some ways is deepening.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Perhaps for my own sake, just to keep a little bit of positivity, what I also would like to bring up is the fact that, women were such key members of resistance movements, both in South Africa and Zimbabwe. In Zimbabwe, it's perhaps overstated, but they joined the Liberation War. A lot of the early recruits had military training. They were key in establishing the running of our training camps overseas. And I'm, sad that we've had steps backwards since independence, but it's something to really focus on, to remember that there was this move forward in terms of the gender dynamics and the possibilities that those created, that we could really be drumming up and reinvigorating and reanimating now. A third question. Someone has said, thank you very much for the talk. Thank you. Given the similarities with the Palestinian context, I'm wondering what kind of international solidarity was or is successful in dismantling these structures. Perhaps especially what kind of advocacy was successful in reaching European or Western or white audiences who are undeniably very complacent regarding Palestine. BDS is being spoken about constantly. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, look, I think international solidarity is very important. It has played a key role in Zimbabwe and particularly in South Africa, getting people across the world to understand that this wasn't a problem specific to a particular area, but a global problem, a global issue, which was a rights question across races, across country. And that construction is what needs to apply to the Palestinian question, that there needs to be this global realization of the major abuses that are taking place in Palestine. These are major human rights abuses, as increasingly recognized. I think there are even discussions within Israeli society itself about these issues, and that the forms of solidarity with both with the Palestinian movement, but also with those critical voices within Israel who are seeing problems emerging, might be an important discussion to think about. But certainly, I think it's absolutely essential to move the international players, because as long as the US and Western European countries provide the kind of legitimation and military support and diplomatic support that they do, and try to constrain the debate around what's going on in Israel, then you're going to have a major challenge. You're going to have a problem which keeps it as a particularity rather than a general human problem that affects us all and not just people in one region.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Brian. International solidarity is very, very important. I mean, so a while back, there was ISM, International Solidarity Movement, that was very much involved and advocated for Palestinian causes. And so, I mean, that was a very good intervention. That was a very good model because ISM basically was run, and recruited, American, university students and American youth to go over to Palestine, to be in solidarity and so on and so forth. I mean, I think such movements are very important, and those kind of movements, student movements, played a very important role in shaming apartheid South Africa. I mean, student movements in the US throughout the 1980s, 1970s, were very important in bringing down, apartheid South Africa, the de-investment, campaigns and so on. These were very helpful, and obviously, the ANC worked closely or were trained in Moscow, in Russia, and so on. So yeah, international solidarity is very important, and I think we do need to develop more of that, when it comes to the Palestinian issue. But I don't know, for some reason, I mean, the last few years, the Palestinian struggle, he has sort of taken a back burner, internationally. So I'm not sure what's going on, but yeah, it's not part of the mainstream conversation like it used to be. For example, when maybe Said was still around, I don't know. It feels like that to me anyway.
No, that's great. Just thinking of, competing priorities or competing ideas of victimhood maybe, or the real, suffering people. At least we have seen in Ukraine, although that has taken away attention from so many struggles around the world. I think, Mandisi, what you were saying about divestment and sanctioning, you implied there, we can see now that it's being done and it can be done, and there is some kind of international solidarity or awareness that people can, draw up in themselves. And now it's just an issue of reorienting that focus back onto Palestine in the knowledge that it can be done. And we've seen it be done. Therefore, we can, hold structures and businesses and governments and communities themselves accountable in those double standards and reapplying them. I also like what you said, Brian, especially about the human rights, just the universal, the objective human rights aspect of it. I think that that's a great way to frame it. It's undeniable. You can't argue with it. It's something that's very visible. It's been reiterated over and over by human rights organizations. And I do believe that it has impact in communities overseas. So yeah, thank you very much. It's been wonderful. So to everybody, we've sadly reached the end of our talk today. I would like to thank our speakers again for giving us their time and their insights, and for giving us so much food for thought on the history of and resistance to systems of violence and domination in South Africa and in the Zimbabwean context with the Palestinian struggle today. I've been hearing parallels the whole way through. I'm sure all of our audience has been. And I do hope that I will see you soon at our upcoming events. Have a great evening, and thank you again to all of us, to everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.